The glass doors of Zenith Innovations were as cold as the company's reputation, and as Adais Okonkwo stepped into the lobby, the chill seemed to seep deep into her bones. She wasn't a woman used to walking into spaces like this, spaces that smelled of power and ambition, where the polished floors reflected more than just shoes, but the carefully constructed lives of those who walked on them. But she belonged here now, even if no one else in the room seemed to think so. They looked at her with the same kind of curiosity they reserved for something out of place, something foreign, something that didn't belong. The receptionist's forced smile was more telling than she would have liked, but she stood tall, her daughter Era by her side. 10 years old, sharp-eyed, with the same intensity Adais had seen in herself as a young woman, the same resilience that had carried her through all the hardships of the last decade. It was Era's face that had led them here today, led them to this moment. Her father, the man who hadn't been part of her life for so long that his name had turned into a whisper, a distant memory. But today, everything was about to change. "Do you have an appointment?" The receptionist's voice was smooth, but there was a crackle of tension behind it. Adais met her gaze and didn't flinch. "We're here to see CEO Kang Ji-hoon." The words landed like a challenge, like a gauntlet thrown at her feet. The woman's eyes flickered for just a moment, and then she turned away, whispering into her headset, the tone of her voice indicating the urgency of the message. Meanwhile, Era, still holding Adai's hand, looked up at her mother with that quiet courage only a child could possess. "Stand tall. We belong anywhere we choose to be," Adais thought. She had taught Era that. It had taken years of struggle, but that lesson had stuck. The elevator doors opened, and out stepped the man who had haunted Adai's thoughts for years, the man who had once been her everything. Kang Ji-hoon, the CEO. The face of Zenith Innovations, a symbol of everything that had gone wrong in her life. A man she had once trusted with her heart, only to be abandoned when things got difficult. He looked just like the memory of the man she had loved, a perfect image of success, wrapped in a designer suit that screamed wealth, a man who seemed to have everything. And yet, there he was, standing before her, his expression shifting from confusion to shock, then to recognition. He wasn't ready for this. He wasn't ready to face the daughter he'd never known. He wasn't ready for her. "Adais," he said, voice cracking, his eyes narrowing as they landed on Era. Adais felt her heart flutter despite herself, but she held it together. "Look at her, Ji-hoon. Really look at her." The silence that followed was thick, almost unbearable. Around them, whispers started to spread like wildfire, employees pulling out phones, some whispering into their headsets, others just watching. But in that moment, Adais didn't care. It wasn't about them. It wasn't about the sleek walls of this corporate temple or the people who were suddenly witnessing a truth long hidden. It was about Era, her daughter, who stood there with a quiet confidence, bowing in front of her estranged father. "Father," Era said in flawless Korean, a word that had once felt like a dream but was now a reality. Her smile was small, a mixture of uncertainty and hope, but it was enough to send a ripple through the room. Ji-hoon stumbled backward, his phone slipping from his hand as the reality hit him like a freight train. "No," his voice broke. "No, this can't be." His eyes locked onto Era once again, disbelief clouding his face. Adais stood still, letting the weight of the situation settle around her. "You kept her from me," Ji-hoon shouted, the anger and fear in his voice raw, cutting through the tension in the air. "No," Adais responded coolly, her tone firm but controlled. "I didn't hide her. Your family made it clear that we weren't welcome." Ji-hoon opened his mouth to argue but paused. His expression shifted, his shoulders stiffened, and he seemed to shrink inward. He couldn't argue with the truth, not now. Era, sensing the undercurrents of the moment, tugged at Adai's sleeve. "Mama, why is everyone staring?" Her voice was small, but her question cut through the tension like a knife. Adais smiled down at her, but there was no warmth in her expression. "Stand tall," she thought again, squeezing her daughter's hand, pulling her close. The world around them might see them as out of place, but they belonged here, whether they liked it or not. Kang Ji-hoon, now clearly unsettled, turned on his heel and led them toward the conference room, every step a battle for control. Inside, the glass walls overlooked Seoul's skyline, but the view felt distant, like a world Adai's didn't belong to anymore. It wasn't just the city that felt foreign to her now, it was the man in front of her. He had changed, and she knew that now. The door closed behind them, and Ji-hoon collapsed into the chair, his hands trembling. "How old is she?" His voice was barely a whisper. 10. "She'll be 11 in March," Adai's replied. "Why no? Why come back after all this time?" His words were full of fear, pain, and confusion. "Because she asked who her father was," Adai's said simply. "And I told her that, even if the answer was complicated, she deserved to know the truth." Era, who had been quiet up until now, spoke up with surprising boldness. "Because Mama says love is complicated," she said in flawless Korean. "But I also deserve the truth." Ji-hoon looked at her, and for the first time, he saw her, not just as a child in front of him, but as a person, as his daughter. The realization hit him hard. This little girl, this stranger, this miracle, was his flesh and blood. The shock of it rattled him more than he cared to admit. But the truth was out now, and there was no going back. Adai's and Era had come for the truth. And now Ji-hoon would have to face it. The days that followed felt like walking through a storm, each step laden with tension, uncertainty, and the weight of decisions that had to be made. What began as a plan to protect her daughter had quickly spiraled into something far more complicated. Adai's had expected pushback, of course. What else could she have expected from the Kang family? But she hadn't anticipated the subtle shifts in Ji-hoon's behavior, the way his presence lingered even when he wasn't around. The forced politeness, the awkwardness, and most unsettling of all, the undercurrent of something deeper that she could neither deny nor ignore. They had agreed on the charade, the public pretense of a relationship, but it had become increasingly difficult to keep the lines clear between what was real and what was fabricated. It was during one of those late-night meetings, held behind closed doors in the glass-walled conference room with the sprawling city view, that Ji-hoon said something that shifted everything. He wasn't looking at her when he spoke, his voice low, distant. "I never wanted this life," he confessed. "I never wanted to be a part of all this. The pressure, the family, the company." He looked at her then, his eyes clouded with something she couldn't place. "But I made choices. And now I have to live with them." Adai swallowed, the room suddenly feeling too small, too suffocating. "So what? You regret everything? Your daughter? Your family?" He shook his head, frustration marking his features. "It's not that simple. I don't even know where to begin. I wasn't ready for this. For her." He gestured toward Era, who was sitting across the room, half distracted by her phone, oblivious to the tension in the air. "How do you just pick up the pieces of a life you left behind?" Adai's chest tightened, and she felt an unfamiliar pang of sympathy. He had been young when they had made the decisions that led them here, young, naive, and unwilling to face the consequences. But those days were gone. This wasn't the same man anymore, was it? Her voice came out sharper than she intended. "You're not the only one who had to live with the consequences. We're still here, Ji-hoon. We're still living with it." He flinched, but she didn't back down. What good was it to pretend, to shield him from the truth? She had lived with the shame, the fear, the loneliness. Era had lived without a father. All the things they had been denied because of a moment's hesitation, a single phone call never made. But now that moment had passed. Now, there was no turning back, no more pretending. They couldn't undo the past, but they could forge a future if they were willing to fight for it. "I'm trying," he said quietly, as if pleading for some kind of understanding. "Trying?" Adai's voice shook. "That's all you've ever done, isn't it? Try." Era looked up at her then, sensing the rising tension. She stood up, walking over to her mother, her little face marked with concern. "Mama, don't be mad at him. He's trying. You told me that sometimes people mess up, but they can still make things right." Adai's heart cracked at the simple truth in Era's words. She had taught her daughter that, taught her that love, though imperfect, could overcome anything. But it was harder to believe it when the scars ran so deep, when everything had been built on lies, on abandoned promises. She pulled Era into a tight hug, trying to steady her own breathing. "I'm not mad, love," Adais whispered, though the words felt foreign in her mouth. "I'm just tired." Ji-hoon was silent for a long time, his gaze locked on the floor. He wasn't the same person she had known all those years ago, and neither was she. Maybe that was the hardest part. This wasn't some reunion of two people who had once been in love, rekindling an old flame. No, this was a negotiation. A game of survival. One where the stakes were too high, and the rules were constantly changing. It wasn't just the Kangs that Adais had to watch out for. The company, Zenith Innovations, was its own beast, and there were people within it who would stop at nothing to maintain the status quo. Sujin, the woman Ji-hoon was still engaged to, was a threat in a very different way. Where Mrs. Kang was cold, calculating, and protective of her family's legacy, Sujin was ruthless. She had the kind of power that came with knowledge of the boardroom, of the corporate world that Ji-hoon had risen to dominate. Sujin wasn't someone you crossed lightly, and she certainly wasn't someone who would let a woman like Adais, someone who had no real ties to the company, stand in her way. And yet, Adais was standing there. She was fighting for Era's future, fighting for a life that had been denied to them for so long. But the closer they got to the truth, the more dangerous it became. The more Ji-hoon seemed to crack under the pressure of his family's demands, the more Adais felt the weight of the lie they were living. What was it all for? To protect Era? To protect herself? Or to find a way to force Ji-hoon to finally face the man he had become? One evening, as they sat in a quiet corner of Ji-hoon's office after hours, a voice cracked through the silence. It was Sujin, her voice smooth as velvet, but the venom in it was unmistakable. "I hear you're playing the part of his fiancée now, Adais. I hope you're not expecting him to choose you over everything he's built." Adais turned to face her, her composure steady despite the underlying fury. "What are you expecting, Sujin? To tear us apart before we even get a chance to stand on our own?" Sujin smiled, but it wasn't kind. "You think you're in control here? You're just a distraction, a momentary lapse in his judgment. Don't get too comfortable." Adais didn't flinch, but inside, a small spark of something deep and primal began to burn. It wasn't just about protecting Era anymore, it was about standing her ground. This wasn't some corporate chess game to her, it was her life. Era's life. And she was done playing by anyone else's rules. "I'm not going anywhere," Adais said, her voice low and unwavering. Sujin's eyes narrowed, but she didn't respond. She didn't need to. The battle lines had been drawn, and both women knew that the game had only just begun. The final confrontation had been inevitable, yet nothing could have fully prepared Adais for the way it unfolded. For weeks, the game of pretend had played out like a carefully orchestrated play, an act of convenience, a facade they both needed to survive. But the cost of living in that lie had begun to wear at them both. Every smile Ji-hoon gave her in public felt more strained, more forced. And each time he looked at Era, she saw the guilt written all over his face, reminder of the time he had lost with his daughter, of the betrayal that had already been done. It was clear now that his family, his mother in particular, had woven a web so intricate, so suffocating, that it was nearly impossible to escape. Mrs. Kang's hold on him was absolute, a smothering force that didn't just control the future of his company, but also the way he saw himself. But nothing, no matter how well planned, could stop the truth from eventually breaking free. It happened in the middle of a corporate gala, as glistening chandeliers hung like diamonds above their heads, and the air buzzed with shallow conversations and the clinking of glasses. Ji-hoon had insisted that Adais attend, said that her presence was important for the image they were building together, that her being seen with him would solidify their engagement in the eyes of the media. But as the night wore on, it became clear to Adais that this was no longer about image. This wasn't about a contract or a performance. She was starting to see the man Ji-hoon had become, and the more she saw, the less she liked what she found. Their private conversation was interrupted by Sujin, who walked into the room with a smug smile that only barely hid her insecurities. She was dressed in a sleek black gown, one that screamed elegance, but Adais could see the underlying coldness in her eyes. Sujin wasn't used to being ignored, and the moment she saw Adais and Ji-hoon standing together, the tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. "You two look so cozy," Sujin said, her voice sweet but carrying the sting of a threat. Adais remained calm, meeting her gaze without hesitation. "We've been busy. But I'm sure you know all about keeping up appearances." Sujin's smile faltered just slightly, but she recovered quickly. "I do. After all, appearances are everything in our world, aren't they?" Her eyes flicked to Ji-hoon, lingering for just a moment too long. "But I hope you're not planning to make promises you can't keep, Ji-hoon. You wouldn't want to embarrass yourself, would you?" Adais stepped forward, placing herself between the two of them, her eyes narrowing. "There are some things that can't be undone, Sujin. And pretending doesn't erase the truth." Sujin's eyes flashed, her smile turning brittle. "You think you've won? You've barely begun to understand the game you're playing." But Adais wasn't finished. "You're right. I've been playing a game, but I'm done. I'm done pretending that I'm something I'm not, and I'm done pretending that I need permission to be here." The words hung in the air like a declaration. Ji-hoon, who had been watching quietly, slowly moved to her side. He wasn't just her fiancé anymore. He was becoming something more in her eyes. Her equal. Sujin stared at them both, her face darkening with a mixture of fury and disbelief. Without another word, she turned on her heel and left, but the damage had been done. Adais could feel the cold weight of the Kang family's influence lurking just beyond the glass doors. They wouldn't let her and Era go without a fight. They would try everything, and they would stop at nothing to control the situation, to bury the truth. Later that night, in the quiet of Ji-hoon's office, Adais found herself sitting across from him, her heart pounding as the weight of their conversation crashed into her. He was no longer just a man who had abandoned her. He was a man who had been forced into a system that wasn't of his making, a system that had tried to shape him, manipulate him, until he no longer recognized himself. "I'm sorry," Ji-hoon whispered, his voice raw. "For everything. For not being there for you. For not being there for her." Adais didn't respond right away. She knew the words were hollow, not because they weren't sincere, but because they were too little, too late. She had spent so many years resenting him, hating him for the hurt he had caused, that hearing him say it now didn't fill the hole she thought it would. But still, she could see the remorse in his eyes, the genuine regret that had taken years to surface. "Do you love her?" Adais asked, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "Do you really love Era?" Ji-hoon looked at her, and for the first time in years, he wasn't hiding. He wasn't playing a part. He wasn't wearing the mask of the CEO or the dutiful son. He was just a man, a father, trying to put the broken pieces of his life back together. "I do," he said softly. "More than I've ever loved anyone." Adais nodded slowly. The answer didn't change the past, but it changed the future. The next morning, as the sun peeked over the horizon, a message came through on Adai's phone. It was from the lawyer Ji-hoon had hired to help them navigate the storm brewing between them and his family. The Kang family's threats were intensifying. Mrs. Kang had already filed papers with the court, seeking to claim guardianship of Era, to rip her away from Adais and place her in the clutches of the family, who had never wanted her in the first place. The battle was just beginning. But this time, Adais wasn't going to run. She wasn't going to cower under their gaze. She had fought too long, too hard, to give up now. This wasn't just about winning, it was about making sure that Era would never feel like she wasn't enough, like she didn't belong. And in that moment, as Ji-hoon stood beside her, ready to fight for them both, Adais realized something important. Love wasn't about perfection. It wasn't about following the rules. It was about showing up when it counted, even if it meant standing alone. She had Era. She had herself. And maybe, just maybe, she had Ji-hoon. Together, they would face whatever came next. The truth, after all, was stronger than any lie they had ever told.